Welcome to our channel. Today, we immerse ourselves in the eerie atmosphere of Whispering Pines. The fog rolled into town like a living, breathing entity, clinging to the weathered facades of historic buildings and obscuring the distant tree line. Jack Holloway, a reclusive phone repairman, gripped the worn leather strap of his toolbox as he stepped out of his old pickup truck. His eyes scanned the empty streets with a familiar sense of unease. This was his home, yet it always felt like a place he didn't quite belong. Jack made his way down the sidewalk, the muffled sound of his footsteps the only interruption to the eerie silence that had settled over the town. It was early evening, but the streetlights had already flickered to life, casting an ethereal glow through the mist. As Jack approached the small office building where he maintained the town's telecommunications system, a faint sound reached his ears, the distant echo of a phone ringing. He paused, brow furrowed, and listened intently. The ringing grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to surround him, piercing the veil of silence. Quickening his pace, Jack hurried up the steps and pushed open the door, stepping into the dimly lit lobby. The phone on the reception desk was vibrating, its shrill tone cutting through the air. Jack moved to answer it, but before he could, the ringing abruptly stopped, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. "What the hell?" he muttered, setting down his toolbox and moving behind the desk to inspect the phone. He ran his fingers over the buttons, checking for any signs of malfunction, but the device appeared to be functioning normally. Glancing at the call log, he found no record of the previous call. Jack's unease deepened as he stood there, alone in the building, the only sound the faint hum of the electrical systems. He was about to dismiss the incident as a simple glitch when the phone suddenly sprang to life again, the shrill ring echoing through the lobby. Steeling himself, Jack answered the call, pressing the receiver to his ear. "Hello?" he spoke, his voice betraying a hint of trepidation. Static crackled on the other end, followed by a faint whisper that sent a chill down his spine. "Help us!" The line went dead, leaving Jack standing there, the phone trembling in his hand. He stared at the receiver, his mind racing to comprehend what had just occurred. This was no ordinary malfunction, something was terribly wrong. Just then, the doors burst open, and a frantic-looking woman hurried inside, her eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Holloway! Thank goodness you're here!" she cried, rushing up to the desk. I just got the most terrible call." The voice, it sounded. "Somehow I doubt that call was meant for you," Jack interrupted, his voice low and guarded. "I just had the same experience." The woman's face paled, and she gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white. "What's happening, Mr. Holloway? Why are the phones acting this way?" Jack shook his head, his gaze fixed on the silent telephone. "I don't know, Mrs. Payne. But I intend to find out." At that moment, the doors swung open once more, and a tall, well-dressed woman strode into the lobby, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Jack recognized her as Dr. Elena Reeves, the new forensic psychologist who had recently arrived in Whispering Pines. "Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice calm and authoritative. "I take it you've been experiencing the same disturbances that have been plaguing the town." Jack nodded, suddenly wary of this outsider's presence. "I have. And I'm guessing you're here to investigate, Doctor." Elena Reeves inclined her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "That's correct. I was called in by Mayor Grayson to assist with this situation. And I understand you're the town's resident expert on the telecommunications system." Jack's jaw tightened at the mention of the mayor's name. "I am. But I work alone, Doctor. I don't need any help from the town's leadership." "Perhaps not," Elena replied evenly. "But I think you'll find that this is a problem that requires more than just your technical expertise." The voices on the phone, they seem to be connected to something much deeper. Something that's been buried in this town for a very long time. Jack felt a chill run down his spine at her words. He knew all too well the secrets that lurked beneath the surface of Whispering Pines, secrets he had spent years trying to forget. And now, it seemed, those ghosts were stirring once more. Edith Payne, who had been watching the exchange with growing anxiety, spoke up, her voice trembling. "Doctor, Reeves, if you're saying there's more to these phone calls than just a technical issue, then what exactly are we dealing with? Elena's gaze shifted to the older woman, her expression grave. I'm not entirely sure, Mrs. Payne, but I intend to find out. And I believe Mr. Holloway's assistance will be crucial in unraveling this mystery. Jack bristled at the implication, his instinct to retreat into his self-imposed isolation warring with the need to understand what was happening in his town. He had spent years avoiding the ghosts of the past, but it seemed they had finally caught up with him. With a resigned sigh, he met Elena's steady gaze. Fine. I'll help. But only because I need to know what's going on. And once this is over, I want nothing more to do with the people of Whispering Pines. Elena nodded, a flicker of understanding passing across her features. Agreed. Let's get to work, Mr. Holloway. The town is counting on us. As the two set off to begin their investigation, Edith Payne watched them go, a haunted expression on her face. She knew, deep in her bones, that the echoes of the past were about to be awakened and that the consequences could be devastating. The first whisper had been heard. Now, the town of Whispering Pines braced itself for what was to come. Jack Holloway's truck rumbled down the winding road, the dense forest of Whispering Pines closing in around him. After receiving the call about the latest round of unsettling phone disturbances, he had reluctantly agreed to meet with Dr. Elena Reeves, the forensic psychologist brought in from the city to assist with the investigation. As he pulled up to the town hall, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Whispering Pines had always been a place of refuge for him, ever since he had moved here years ago seeking solitude. But now, the familiar surroundings seemed to carry a heavy, oppressive weight, as if the very walls of the buildings were imbued with the town's haunting history. Jack stepped out of his truck, his eyes scanning the parking lot. There, standing with an air of confidence and purpose, was Dr. Reeves, her auburn hair gleaming in the overcast light. He took a deep breath and approached her, bracing himself for the conversation to come. Dr. Reeves, he said, his voice low and guarded. I'm Jack Holloway. Thanks for meeting me. Elena extended her hand, offering him a measured smile. Mr. Holloway, I appreciate you taking the time. Shall we? She gestured towards the town hall, and the two made their way inside, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty lobby. Once they were settled in a small conference room, Elena got right to the point. I've been reviewing the reports from the phone disturbances. It seems the calls are affecting a wide range of residents, from the mayor's office to the elderly living alone. Do you have any insights that could help us understand the pattern? Jack leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. The calls are coming from different numbers, but they all seem to be originating from the town's landline network. I've been trying to trace the source, but it's like they're coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Elena nodded, her pen poised over her notepad. And have you noticed any commonalities among the people receiving the calls? Any connection between them? Jack hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window. That's the thing. The victims don't seem to have much in common. They're all long-time residents, but beyond that, it's a mix of ages, backgrounds, social standing. The only thing they share is that they all lived here 20 years ago. A flash of recognition crossed Elena's features. 20 years ago. That's when that tragic incident occurred, isn't it? The one that rocked the town? Jack's eyes narrowed, and he nodded slowly. Yeah. The Bell family murders. It was the worst thing to ever happen in Whispering Pines. Elena leaned forward, her expression shifting to one of empathy. I see. And you were here during that time, weren't you, Mr. Holloway? Jack's jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed to retreat into himself. Yes. I was here. It's not something I like to talk about. Sensing his discomfort, Elena offered a sympathetic nod. I understand. But if these phone calls are somehow connected to that tragedy, then uncovering the truth may be the key to stopping them. Can you tell me what you know about the Bell family murders? Jack sighed heavily, his gaze distant. It was a brutal crime. The entire Bell family was found dead in their home. The investigation dragged on for months, but they never caught the killer. The town was in shock, and it changed everything. Elena listened intently, her pen moving across the page. And you were involved somehow, weren't you? Jack's eyes flickered with a mixture of pain and guilt. I was the one who found them. The Bells' bodies. I was the one who called it in. A weighted silence settled between them, the gravity of Jack's words hanging in the air. Elena waited patiently, allowing him the space to continue. After a long moment, Jack spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I should have been able to do something. I should have been able to save them. But I was too late. Elena reached across the table, her hand resting gently on Jack's arm. This wasn't your fault, Mr. Holloway. From what I've read, the investigation was a mess. There were no clear leads, no suspects. You couldn't have known what was going to happen. Jack shook his head, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Maybe. But I still have to live with it. That's why I left town for so long. I couldn't face the ghosts of the past. And now they've come back to haunt me. Elena gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. I'm sorry you've had to carry this burden for so long. But you're not alone anymore. If these phone calls are connected to the Bell family murders, then we need to work together to find out the truth. Can you tell me anything else that might be relevant? Jack took a deep, steadying breath. Well, there was one thing that always bothered me about the case. The Bells were a well-liked family, the kind of people you never expect to be the victims of such a heinous crime. And the way they were killed. It was brutal, almost ritualistic. Like the killer had a personal vendetta. Elena's brow furrowed as she scribbled down Jack's words. Ritualistic, you say? That's an interesting detail. Do you think the killer might have had a specific reason for targeting the Bells? Jack shook his head, his gaze distant. I wish I knew. All I know is that the town was never the same after that night. The pain and the grief just seeped into everything. And now it's all coming back. The sound of the conference room door opening interrupted their conversation, and Mayor Grayson strode in, his expression stern. Mr. Holloway. Dr. Reeves. I see you're getting acquainted. His gaze settled on Jack, a hint of warning in his tone. I hope you're not dredging up the past. Some things are best left buried. Jack and Elena exchanged a meaningful look, the unspoken tension palpable in the air. As Mayor Grayson took a seat at the head of the table, the stage was set for a collision course between the town's past and its present, a collision that would force them all to confront the echoes of a tragedy that had never truly been laid to rest. As the unsettling phone calls continued to plague Whispering Pines, Jack Holloway found himself increasingly haunted by the echoes of his own past. The more he and Dr. Elena Reeves delved into the mystery, the more his carefully constructed walls began to crumble, exposing the wounds he had long tried to conceal. Jack's dreams had become a revolving door of fractured memories, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. In the still of the night, he would wake with a start, the phantom ring of a phone still ringing in his ears. Images of a dark, wooded path and the anguished cries of a young girl would linger, leaving him shaken and disoriented. During the day, as he accompanied Elena on their investigation, the tension only mounted. Every new lead, every interview with a distraught resident, chipped away at the facade he had carefully maintained. The town's trauma was becoming inextricably linked to his own, and he found himself unable to maintain the emotional distance he had once cultivated. The frequency of the calls seems to be increasing, Elena observed as they reviewed the latest reports from the police. And the content is becoming more personal, more targeted. Her brow furrowed with concern. I'm starting to suspect this is more than just a random phenomenon. There's an underlying purpose to these disturbances. Jack nodded, his mind drifting to the call he had received the previous night, a whispered voice calling out his name, laced with a haunting familiarity that had sent chills down his spine. Whatever's behind this, it's tapping into something deeply buried. He murmured, his gaze distant. Elena studied him for a moment, perceptive eyes taking in the subtle shifts in his demeanor. Jack, I understand this must be difficult for you, she said gently. But if we're going to get to the bottom of this, I need you to be fully present. What are you not telling me? Jack let out a heavy sigh, his fingers drumming restlessly against the tabletop. I'm not sure, he admitted, his voice tinged with uncertainty. There are pieces of my past in this town that I've tried to keep buried. But the more we dig, the more it feels like those ghosts are being awakened. Then it's time to confront them, Elena stated firmly. Whatever happened here 20 years ago, it's clearly still haunting this place. And if we have any hope of stopping these calls, we need to understand the root cause. Jack's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena saw a flash of raw emotion in his eyes: fear, guilt, and a deep, lingering sorrow. I'm not sure I'm ready to face that, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Elena could respond, a sudden commotion from outside drew their attention. Rushing to the window, they observed a crowd of panicked townspeople gathered in the street, clutching their phones and speaking in hushed, frantic tones. Exchanging a weighted glance, Jack and Elena quickly made their way outside, bracing themselves for the latest development in the town's unfolding nightmare. As they approached the crowd, a collective shudder passed through the gathered residents. It's happening again, one woman gasped, her face pale. The calls, they're everywhere. Jack and Elena listened intently as the townspeople recounted their experiences, reports of phones ringing with no one on the other end, the sounds of muffled cries and the eerie crackle of static. The intensity of the disturbances had escalated, and it was clear the entity behind the calls was growing stronger. We need to get to the bottom of this, Elena declared, her gaze sweeping over the anxious crowd. Whatever darkness has taken hold of this town, we have to confront it head on. Are you with us? A hush fell over the group, the weight of the situation palpable. Then, slowly, Olivia Grayson stepped forward, her eyes resolute. I'm in, she said, her voice steady. It's time we face the demons of the past, once and for all. Jack met Olivia's gaze, a flicker of recognition passing between them. Nodding, he turned to Elena. Count me in, he said, his own determination hardening. I can't run from this anymore. As the three of them stood united, the crowd parted, clearing a path. It was time to unravel the threads of Whispering Pines' haunted past and confront the entity that had been awakened by the town's collective trauma. The investigation intensified, with Jack and Elena delving deeper into the details of the tragic event that had occurred 20 years prior. Painstakingly, they pieced together the fragmented accounts, uncovering a disturbing web of lies, cover-ups, and unresolved guilt. At the heart of it all was Mayor Grayson, a man whose outward veneer of respectability hid the dark secrets he had fought to bury. As the truth began to surface, he grew increasingly desperate, using every resource at his disposal to impede Jack and Elena's efforts. You have no idea what you're meddling in, Grayson warned them, his eyes burning with a mixture of fear and fury. The past is best left undisturbed. Some things are better off forgotten. But Jack and Elena refused to be deterred. With Olivia's reluctant assistance, they uncovered the chilling details of the event that had shattered the town 2 decades ago, a tragedy involving the mayor, his daughter, and a group of local teenagers, all of whom had been irrevocably scarred by the experience. As the phone calls continued to escalate, reverberating throughout Whispering Pines like a malevolent chorus, the trio realized that the entity behind the disturbances was not simply a remnant of the past, but a manifestation of the town's unresolved trauma. It was feeding on the collective guilt and anguish that had been buried and suppressed for far too long. The revelation left Jack reeling, his own buried memories bubbling to the surface. He had been there, on that fateful night, and his role in the tragedy had haunted him ever since. Confronting this truth was the final piece of the puzzle, one that would force him to confront the demons he had tried to outrun for so long. The chapter ended with a town-wide blackout, the ominous sound of ringing phones echoing through the darkness. As Jack, Elena, and Olivia stood trapped in the eerie silence, they knew the entity was closing in, drawing them deeper into a nightmarish confrontation with the past. The town of Whispering Pines had succumbed to a palpable sense of unease. The once quaint and tranquil streets now felt heavy with an oppressive atmosphere, as if the very air had been infused with the town's collective anxiety. Jack Holloway sat alone in his modest apartment, the glow of his phone casting an eerie light across his weary features. The latest round of unsettling calls had left him shaken, the ghostly voices echoing in his mind. He knew he couldn't ignore them any longer, not when the town's well-being hung in the balance. Across town, Dr. Elena Reeves pored over the notes and evidence she had gathered, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. The patterns she had uncovered in the phone calls were deeply troubling, hinting at a darkness that seemed to permeate every corner of Whispering Pines. She needed to find a way to break through the town's collective denial and confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As night fell, the phone calls grew in both frequency and intensity. Scattered reports of strange occurrences began to filter in, residents experiencing vivid hallucinations, shared nightmares, and a growing sense of foreboding that refused to be shaken. The town's fragile veneer of normalcy was crumbling, and Jack and Elena knew they had to act quickly before the situation spiraled out of control. Summoning their courage, the two reluctant allies set out to uncover the truth, their steps quickening as the town descended into a state of growing chaos. The usually quiet streets were now alive with the sound of panicked voices and the blaring of sirens, a discordant symphony that only served to heighten the sense of impending doom. Jack's mind raced as they navigated the darkened roads, the memories of his own past in Whispering Pines bubbling to the surface. He had buried those traumatic recollections for so long, but now they threatened to overwhelm him, casting doubt on everything he thought he knew. "I should have never come back here," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Elena reached out, her hand resting briefly on his arm. "We have to see this through, Jack. Whatever happened in the past, the town needs us now. We're the only ones who can stop this." Her words, tinged with a mix of urgency and empathy, seemed to steady him. With a deep breath, Jack nodded and pressed on, determined to uncover the truth, no matter the personal cost. As they arrived at the town hall, the magnitude of the situation became clear. Panicked residents milled about, some clutching their phones as if their very lives depended on it. The mayor, Tom Grayson, stood at the center of the chaos, his usually stoic demeanor now laced with a thinly veiled desperation. "What's happening?" Jack demanded, striding up to the mayor. Grayson's eyes narrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. "The phone calls there. They're getting worse. The whole town is in a state of hysteria. We need to access your phone records, Mayor." Elena interjected, her tone firm but measured. "There has to be a pattern, a connection we're missing." The mayor hesitated, his gaze darting about nervously. "I'm not sure that's a good idea. This situation is delicate, and I don't want to cause any unnecessary." "With all due respect, sir," Jack interrupted, his voice low and intense. "The town is falling apart. If you have information that could help us put a stop to this, you need to share it. Now." Grayson's shoulders sagged, the weight of his secrets evident in the subtle slump of his posture. "Very well," he conceded, his words laced with resignation. "Follow me." As they made their way through the chaos of the town hall, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to loom larger, the whispers of the wind more insistent. It was as if the town itself had become a living, breathing entity, intent on keeping its darkest secrets buried. Elena sensed Jack's unease, her own trepidation growing with each step. "Do you feel it too?" she murmured, her gaze darting about the dimly lit corridors. "Yeah," Jack replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like the town is, alive somehow. Waiting." The mayor led them to his office, the door creaking ominously as he pushed it open. Grayson moved to his desk, his fingers trembling as he began to sift through the stacks of papers. "Here," he said, handing them a thick folder. "These are the phone records you requested. I'll leave you to it." As the mayor retreated, Jack and Elena exchanged a meaningful glance. The weight of the folder in their hands felt heavy, a tangible representation of the town's dark secrets. Settling at the desk, they began to pore over the records, their brows furrowing in concentration. The pattern was undeniable. The phone calls were targeting specific individuals, all of whom had a connection to the tragic event from 20 years ago. "This is it, Jack," Elena breathed, her eyes widening. "The key to unraveling the mystery. The phone calls, they're deliberately trying to awaken the town's collective trauma." Jack nodded, his expression grim. "And the entity behind it all is feeding on that pain, growing stronger with each new victim." Their realization was met with a sudden, jarring silence. The chaos that had previously filled the town hall had been replaced by an eerie stillness, as if the very air had been drained of sound. "What's happening?" Elena whispered, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk. Jack's gaze darted towards the windows, his breath catching in his throat. "The power," he murmured. "It's gone." In that moment, the town of Whispering Pines was plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of their phones. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, and the persistent whispers of the wind seemed to echo with malevolent intent. Suddenly, a collective phone ring pierced the silence, the shrill tone echoing through the deserted corridors. Exchanging a look of dread, Jack and Elena steeled themselves and answered the call, bracing for whatever horrors the entity had in store for them. The weight of Whispering Pines' haunted past had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. Jack Holloway, Dr. Elena Reeves, and Olivia Grayson stood united, facing the malevolent entity that had been unleashed upon the town. They knew that to silence the echoes of the past, they would have to confront the darkest secrets buried within their own hearts. As the trio prepared for the final showdown, the town around them descended into a waking nightmare. The once familiar streets of Whispering Pines had been transformed, the buildings and landmarks warped and distorted, as if the very fabric of reality had been ripped asunder. The air was thick with the stench of fear and the relentless whispers that seemed to emanate from every corner. Jack's mind raced as he tried to recall the fragments of his repressed memories, the traumatic events that had shaped his life and bound him to this doomed town. He felt the weight of his past actions bearing down on him, a burden he had tried to outrun for so long. But now, there was no escape. Beside him, Elena's usually composed demeanor had given way to a deep-seated anxiety. Her training and expertise had prepared her for many challenges, but confronting the manifestation of collective trauma was unlike anything she had encountered before. She knew that the key to defeating the entity lay in understanding the underlying psychological forces at play, but the sheer magnitude of Whispering Pines' trauma threatened to overwhelm her. Olivia, the mayor's estranged daughter, had returned to the town she had so desperately tried to leave behind. Her initial reluctance had given way to a fierce determination to uncover the truth and, in doing so, finally confront the demons that had plagued her family for 2 decades. Though the weight of the past hung heavy on her shoulders, she refused to be cowed by it. As the trio made their way through the warped, nightmarish landscape, flashes of memory began to surface, glimpses of the town's tragic history that had been so carefully concealed. Olivia's recollections painted a disturbing picture of the events from 20 years ago, a cover-up orchestrated by her own father, the respected Mayor Grayson, to bury the truth and protect his reputation. The flashbacks grew more vivid and visceral, revealing the full extent of the town's collective trauma. A tragic accident, a desperate attempt to hide the evidence, and the shattering of lives, all of it had been swept under the rug, left to fester and mutate into the malevolent entity that now threatened to consume them all. Jack's heart raced as he recognized his own role in the tragedy, the weight of his guilt threatening to crush him. He had been there, on that fateful night, a silent witness to the events that had irrevocably altered the course of Whispering Pines. The memories he had suppressed for so long now flooded his consciousness, a tidal wave of anguish and remorse. As the trio delved deeper into the town's history, they realized that the entity was not just a manifestation of the past, but a manifestation of the collective guilt and denial that had allowed the trauma to fester. It fed on the unresolved pain, the unspoken secrets, and the desperate attempts to bury the truth. The more the characters confronted their own culpability, the stronger the entity became. The confrontation with the entity was a harrowing, mind-bending ordeal, as the characters were forced to navigate a nightmarish dreamscape where past and present collided. Visions of the tragic accident, the cover-up, and the town's spiral into silence assaulted their senses, threatening to overwhelm them. In the midst of the chaos, Mayor Grayson made a desperate last-ditch effort to maintain control, revealing the full extent of his own involvement in the town's downfall. He had been the architect of the cover-up, driven by his desire to protect his legacy and the reputation of Whispering Pines. But his actions had only served to empower the entity, fueling its insatiable hunger for the town's unresolved trauma. As the confrontation reached its crescendo, Jack, Elena, and Olivia realized that the only way to defeat the entity was to confront their own personal demons, to fully acknowledge the weight of their past actions and the collective guilt that had been allowed to fester. It was a realization that threatened to tear them apart, as the entity took advantage of their vulnerabilities, exploiting their deepest fears and insecurities. The chapter ends on a harrowing note, with the trio on the brink of defeat, the entity's malevolent presence looming ever larger. The town's haunting past had finally caught up with them, and the fate of Whispering Pines hung in the balance. Jack felt the weight of the town's past bearing down on him as he made his way through the fog-shrouded streets of Whispering Pines. The chilling phone calls had intensified, the entity behind them growing stronger with each passing moment. He knew that he and Elena had to confront this malevolent force, but the fear of dredging up his own darkest secrets made him hesitate. As he approached the town hall, he spotted Elena and Olivia huddled together, their faces etched with concern. Olivia's eyes were red-rimmed, a testament to the emotional toll the investigation had taken on her. "Jack, thank God you're here," Elena said, her voice trembling. "The calls have reached a fever pitch, and the townspeople are barely holding it together. We need to act now before the entity completely overwhelms us." Jack nodded grimly, steeling himself for what was to come. "I know what I have to do, but you two need to be ready. This is going to get ugly." Olivia placed a hand on his arm, her expression resolute. "I'm with you, Jack. Whatever it takes to silence the echoes of the past." The trio made their way into the town hall, where Mayor Grayson was barricaded in his office, desperately trying to maintain control. The air crackled with tension as they confronted him. "This has gone on long enough, Grayson," Jack said, his voice low and menacing. "It's time to stop running and face the truth." The mayor's eyes darted around the room, his composure slipping. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've done nothing wrong." Elena stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "We know about the cover-up, the lies you've been telling for the past 20 years. The victims deserve justice, Grayson. And the town deserves to heal." Grayson's face twisted in anguish, his mask of authority crumbling. "You have no idea what's at stake. I did what I had to do to protect this town, to protect my family." Jack moved closer, his eyes burning with fury. "Your protection has only condemned us all. The entity, the echoes of the past, they won't be silenced until we confront the truth." Olivia spoke up then, her voice laced with a lifetime of pain. "It's time, Dad. Time to stop the lies and take responsibility. For Mom, for the others, for all of us." Grayson's shoulders slumped, the fight leaving him. I don't know if I can." "You have to try," Jack said, his tone softening. "We all do. This ends here." With a nod, Grayson led them to the town's old community center, a place that had once been a hub of activity but now lay abandoned and forgotten. As they entered the building, the air grew thick with an oppressive, otherworldly presence. "This is where it happened," Grayson whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where the tragedy unfolded, where we tried to bury the truth." Jack felt a familiar chill run down his spine, memories he had long suppressed now surging to the surface. He could almost hear the echoes of the past, the screams and anguished pleas. Elena placed a hand on his arm, her eyes reflecting her own struggles with trauma. "Jack, we're here. You don't have to face this alone." Taking a deep breath, Jack allowed the memories to wash over him, no longer trying to push them away. He saw the faces of those who had been lost, the innocence shattered by the events of that fateful night. Olivia and Grayson joined them, each bearing the weight of their own guilt and sorrow. Together, they confronted the specter that had taken root in the town, a manifestation of their collective trauma. The entity materialized before them, a swirling vortex of darkness and malice. It lashed out, feeding on the fear and anguish that permeated the room. Jack and Elena braced themselves, prepared to face the onslaught. But as the entity attacked, something unexpected happened. The townspeople, drawn by the commotion, began to filter into the community center, their faces etched with a mixture of terror and determination. Mark Donovan, the skeptical police officer, stepped forward, his eyes blazing with resolve. "We won't let this thing destroy us anymore. Not after all we've been through." Edith Payne, the elderly resident with ties to the town's history, raised her trembling voice. "We must face our demons together. Only then can we truly heal." One by one, the people of Whispering Pines joined the confrontation, each adding their own strength and courage to the fight. Jack and Elena watched in awe as the entity recoiled, its power diminished by the collective force of the town's shared trauma. In that moment, Jack knew what he had to do. Stepping forward, he opened himself up to the full weight of his own past, embracing the pain and guilt he had carried for so long. As he did so, the entity let out a piercing wail, its essence beginning to unravel. Elena joined him, her own experiences with trauma fueling her resolve. "We won't let you feed on our pain any longer. This ends now." Olivia and Grayson, their hands clasped together, added their own voices to the chorus, the walls of denial and secrecy finally crumbling. The entity thrashed and writhed, its power waning as the townspeople confronted their collective trauma. Jack felt a surge of energy coursing through him, a strength he had never known. With a final, agonizing scream, the entity dissolved, its echoes fading into the shadows. Silence fell over the community center, the air thick with the weight of what had been endured. Jack looked around, his eyes meeting those of the other survivors, a silent understanding passing between them. Olivia embraced her father, their tears mingling as they finally began to heal the rift that had divided them. Elena placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, her gaze conveying a depth of empathy and respect that transcended words. It would not be an easy path forward, the scars of the past too deep to ever fully erase. But in that moment, the people of Whispering Pines knew that they had taken the first step towards reclaiming their town, their lives, and their future. The echoes would never be silenced, but they would no longer haunt them. Here, in the aftermath of their confrontation with the darkness, the faint whispers of hope began to take root. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Whispering Pines. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video, push the bell icon for notifications, and share it with your friends. Your support helps us create more immersive content like this. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.